Around the mid-1990s, the European Union was at its peak of popularity as measured famously by Eurobarometer data. The data reflects deeper trends, such as the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, which had had a deep impact on European history, in a way given the European Union a strong sense of negative integration. The West, democracy, and the European Union in the mid-1990s seemed to have clearly won, and was celebrated as such by people like Francis Fukuyama, and of course the declaration of the end of history. So it seemed. A day is a long time in politics, a week is even longer, and a few years longer still. So now in 2017, we're clearly somewhere else. We see the rise of populism and authoritarianism across the world, deep skepticism about supranationalism, Euroscepticism, of course, in Europe, and here in the UK, we have Brexit. Catherine De Vries is uniquely qualified to give this talk this evening, not just because she's just written a book, which is coming out with Oxford in February 2018, but because of her background. She's Professor of Politics and in the Department of Government at the University of Essex, an Associate Member of the Nuffield College, Oxford, a sort of bastion of good social science. And she's a strong commitment demonstrated over long periods of time to unraveling some of the most important social, political, and economic issues facing Europe today. And she will bring all that to bear now on her lecture, which is a taste to come of the book, of course, and we welcome you very warmly here this evening, Catherine. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you very much, David, for the invitation. Also, it's going to be a little bit of a talk about Brexit as well, but it's going to be more a comparative talk about Europe. And it's probably going to be a little bit of a sales pitch for a book, because this is what I've been working on, and I've been kind of sitting in the ivory tower writing these kind of things, and now I would like to kind of give you my perspective on what's going on. So I think the image of the cover of the book is kind of illustrative of what I'm going to talk about. That's one, this kind of British balloon, not entirely gone yet, but kind of moving up. And then the EU, a collection of kind of national balloons or national flags. And that's what you're going to see in a minute. It's going to be crucial to the way I understand the development of Euroscepticism. So before I go into trying to make sense of what's been going on and trying to carve out important developments and what we might be expecting in years to come, although prediction is not something that social scientists at the moment are best in, I want us to do a little thought experiment. So this is one of Europe's founding fathers, Jean Monnet. Many things have been coined after him. For example, the chairs in many universities. And imagine that he would have fallen asleep in, at that time, kind of this is what the EU looked like, a kind of a male enterprise, but a table with a couple of people around it, and that was the European coal and steel community. For those of you who studied European integration, it's not without a doubt why that was the European coal and steel, because those were the kind of military army industries, right, where integration first started to develop. And imagine that he would have fallen asleep in one of these meetings. Arguably, they're going to have been rather dull as well, so he just kind of dozed off. And he would have woken up, so I'm just trying to find out the clicker, yes, to what's currently the European Union. So let's just kind of imagine what Jean Monnet would have thought. So his first reaction would have been, wow, what happened? There is an anthem, there is a flag, there is a coin, the euro, not in all EU member states, but in many. There's a parliament, well actually there are several parliaments in Strasbourg and Brussels. There's a court, and there's decades of peace. And the kind of trophy of that was the Nobel Peace Prize granted to the European Union on the basis of its accomplishment of securing peace. And against the backdrop of where European integration developed as a way in order to see peace on the, in that time, West European continent, and later on European continent, more broadly defined, this would have been a kind of a wow reaction, maybe beyond his dreams, right? But if you would have started looking more closely, maybe the reaction would have been, oh no, what's going on? So here we see Marine Le Pen and Geert Wilders. So Marine Le Pen, the leader of, or still leader of the Front National in France, the radical right party. Geert Wilders, his party for freedom, as it's called, is also a far-right party, both intrinsically Eurosceptic parties. Actually, Geert Wilders' party, he defected from the Liberal Party, the Tory party in the Netherlands, in the 2005 constitutional referendum and mobilized against the constitutional referendum. Actually, the founding of the party was based on anti-EU sentiment. Nigel Farage, right, we're going to take our country back. Then the Eurozone crisis with Greece. Italy is still going on. Spain has seen some recovery, but still not entirely sure what's going to happen. And then also the refugee crisis, right, which is really over the last periods kind of developed sentiment in a more negative, in a more skeptical direction. So what I'm going to try today is to talk a little bit about what's the matter with Europe, in the same way that Laurie Bartels, an American political scientist, wrote a piece, What's the Matter with Kansas? And later on in the kind of recent work, What's the Matter with Wisconsin in the United States, where Trump voters were studied. So what's the matter with Europe? Then, oh, I see the numbering is not, it should be 2. What is, they're all important questions. So what is Euroscepticism actually? We use the coin, and we coined this term is used a lot, but what does it actually mean? And we're going to try to more analytically define it. And where is it most pronounced, among whom, and what do these people actually want? So it's really trying to just do a mapping exercise of what it looks like. And then also the last question, why should we actually care about this? And at first I didn't have so much of that in the original book or in the talk, but I gave a talk in Brussels and that changed everything. People in the Commission were saying, why do we care about Euroscepticism at all? Why do we care about public opinion? So I really, as someone who studies public opinion for years now, think of course it's crucially important because politicians need to be elected. But nonetheless, this wasn't entirely something that had sickered through in Brussels. So I'm going to spend some more time on that as well and try to kind of also carve out what the EU could perhaps do in a response to some of, if it would want to do that at all, as a response to some of these developments and these patterns in Euroscepticism. Plus a little bit on Brexit, because we're in the UK and Brexit is also important. But the majority of the talk is not going to be about that. And I've realized now I have to be quite careful about what I say about Brexit because it's all going to be monitored or in the Daily Mail. So part 1, what's the matter with Europe? And what I'm specifically going to focus on is if in the trends of Euroscepticism as we see them, for example, expressed in voting for Eurosceptic parties, or for example in the Brexit campaign, can we understand these developments from existing explanations of public opinion towards the EU? And what I'm going to try to argue is that actually some of these recent developments throw up important puzzles, and I'm later on trying to, of course, in a kind of different theoretical approach, trying to make sense of what's going on. So first, and I think that came very nicely across in terms of the kind of like the peak of support in the early 1990s, but also actually for a long time, public support for the EU is seen as largely irrelevant, and apparently in some Brussels circles, it's still being seen as irrelevant. And this is highlighted very nicely in one of the citations of Ernst Haas in Uniting Europe, one of the kind of key books on European integration from the 1960s, and this is a literal quote. "It is as impractical as it is unnecessary to have recourse to general public opinion surveys. It suffices to single out and define the political elites in participating countries, to study their reactions to integration and, in a sense, changes in attitude on their part." And this in some way reflects how we think about European integration from people like Monet, Schuman, other kind of intellectuals in Europe at that moment in time, that this was an elite-driven project. This was a project not coming from the bottom up, and probably parts of the mess we're in right now is due to that, but it was an elite-driven project in trying to no more Second World War in Western Europe, and we need to develop institutions in order to secure that. And that was also in the writings and in the memoirs of Jean Monnet. Ideas come and go, institutions last. That is his, one of his quotes. So it was an elite-driven project. And at that moment in time, Lindbergh and Scheingolds, so people who studied public opinion in the 1970s, kind of characterized it as a permissive consensus. And the permissive consensus was more or less that people didn't care enough about or kind of were more or less supportive of what their elites were doing in Brussels, and they gave them in some ways a leap of faith to do whatever they wanted in Brussels, because that was going to be more and less in line with their interest. And that relationship has really broken down. Some authors talk about a constraining dissensus, so the degree to which people disagree about Europe, and that disagreement now is constraining what elites can do. And I'll try and come back to that at some parts. But this was kind of the backdrop of how public opinion was perceived in European integration literature, partly as irrelevant, and it was just the elites that we should focus on. So if we cared about opinion, it was about the opinion of elites. Well, times have changed, as David already alluded to. Not only Brexit. Brexit is probably one of the most probably will go down as one of the most historical events. This is the first time that a population says no while already being a member. We have seen populations not wanting to become members, but we haven't seen a situation in which a member wants to leave. But it's not just a British phenomenon, in the sense this is just giving you election results of the 2014 European parliamentary election. I'm also comparing those rather than national elections because this is the same electoral system and the same electoral rules. So if we can think about a situation, in the UK, for example, if you look at it, we have tactical voting, strategic voting, you have that in many other systems as well. So here you could get kind of people voting with the heart. This is fully PR, proportional representation. So the percentages of votes are translated into seats. And these are the percentages this is the vote shares for hard Eurosceptic parties. And hard Eurosceptic parties is a kind of a term coined by Paul Taggart and co-authors, which are parties that basically reject the European Union as such. And those are different from soft Eurosceptic parties that might reject certain ideas or certain policies, but do not want to leave. So these are parties that want to leave in their manifestos, and they've been quoted by myself and others. So you can think of UKIP, but you can also think of the Front National, who in their party manifesto had leave. You can think of the Danish People's Party, of the Freedom Party in Austria. In the Netherlands, actually, you find them both on the radical left and the radical right. So the Socialist Party, the radical left party, and also Geert Wilders' party. So interestingly, what we see here, I just want you to kind of take that away already. I'm just going to see, yeah, that works. So these are kind of countries, just keep in the back of your head, where the level of Eurosceptic, hard Eurosceptic vote is very high. And why this is important, because it actually goes a little bit counter the expectation we have on the basis of theories of why people would support the European Union or not. So one of the dominant explanations has been by a good friend, someone who wrote on the back of my book as well. So there's kind of a lineage. 20 years later, I really see this as one of the pivotal books on European integration. And that was interest in integration, that already the title says it. This is an interest explanation of support. So why would people support European integration or further integration or membership? Well, high income and highly skilled workers do that, and countries that do relatively well economically. Why? Because they can reap the benefits of the market. Right? So they're benefiting. Because they're benefiting, it's in their interest, they're supportive. It's kind of simple idea. And it's kind of on a human capital argument. For example, high-skilled workers, they have certain language advantages, and therefore they can go and move to different places, right? Or countries that do fairly well, well, they apparently have a European integration system that helps their economy to grow, right? So there's some problems with this if we look at these European parliamentary election results that I just showed you about. So now, notice here on the y-axis is that same hard Eurosceptic support that I showed you before, and now on the x-axis, it's the unemployment rate. That's one element to get. I could also use GDP or something like that. Inflation is not so good to use in the EU because of the Eurozone, right? Inflation rates are not necessarily individually set. So what we would expect if it was at the aggregate, if it was about interest, we should actually expect countries that have not fared well in the Eurozone crisis to turn against this union, because that union is clearly not in their interest economically. And the reverse should hold true in countries that do fairly well. So what we actually see is the opposite of that expectation. We see countries, you remember those ones that we just saw on the previous slide, Denmark, Sweden, Great Britain, Austria, the Netherlands, but also France to some extent, that have done really well in the Eurozone crisis, that arguably have benefited from the euro being an undervalued currency for their economy, right? So if you had a Deutschmark now, it would be as high as the Swiss franc, right? So they've benefited from this process, and other countries, for example, a country like Spain or also Greece, right, where hard Eurosceptic support is fairly low, so even a party like Syriza doesn't want to leave the European Union. They had the referendum, but they decided not to leave, right? It's the opposite. Spain, a country that doesn't even have a hard Eurosceptic party, right? So it really doesn't fit so nicely with this idea that it should be interest. Interestingly, when we go to some of the other countries that were hard hit, Ireland, Cyprus, Latvia, Spain, right? So we see no or very limited support for hard Eurosceptic parties. It's the same if I just take public opinion rather than behavioral outcomes. So, but then even if we go at the individual level, you could say, well, maybe this is reflecting debtor and creditor relationships. That actually doesn't really work that well either, because you see a large support for hard Eurosceptic vote share for countries that are not bailing out any other country, Denmark, Sweden, that are not part of the euro. But even if we go at the more kind of individual level and we're trying to look more with, at the within country level, and we look at variations, so even though there was clearly a relationship to parts of the country doing fairly, doing less well than, let's say, London, for example, voting to leave, the pattern in the UK, when you look at the nitty-gritty of it, is less clear than you think. So, for example, one of the biggest cues on that notorious night on the 31st of June was that the Sunderland share of leave was much higher than expected, right? We weren't expected that the predictions were that Sunderland would leave, but it would just be a very, very, very small margin. At a certain point, then predictions were like John Curtis and others were like, wow, this could actually go the other way. So Sunderland is kind of your average kind of in the interest explanation, your kind of average kind of environment where you think leave should have won. So if you take unemployment rate and average house prices as indications for grievances in wealth, right? And we can do on the basis of other literature that has done that before us, we say that Sunderland overall is poorer and also has a much higher unemployment rate, i.e. economic grievances are higher than the rest of the country. But interestingly, we also saw very sharp Leave votes in the south of England, counties and constituencies that are fairly well off, and that are doing very well in terms of employment, and where people are on average quite wealthy. Some people suggest, well, Bournemouth, that is the example, is pensioners. Well, actually, not really. Bournemouth is called the Silicon Beach now, right? It has the highest level of tech company growth in the UK, much higher than London. So that's not the only story, and you see that much more within the South, that you had richer constituencies that voted out. So it doesn't fit so nicely with this interest in explanation. So another explanation of support has been, well, it's more identity. It has to do with the sense of feeling British or feeling very strongly nationally attached to your country. And that's kind of their critique. Well, EU is not only market integration, it's also a sense of belonging, or a Schicksalsgemeinschaft, one would say in German, a fate that's commonly shared. And if people don't necessarily identify with the European Union, they're going to turn against it. Well, even here, if we look at some of the data, this is the Eurobarometer over a very long period of time, asks questions like, do you feel national, do you feel European, do you feel European only, do you feel national only? And this literature kind of suggests that those people who feel exclusively national, so national only, are much more likely to be Eurosceptic, right? That's the kind of argument. The same is that then extreme right parties who mobilize these identity considerations against the EU, when you have mobilization of these parties, you also should see a high increase of Eurosceptic vote shares. So if we look at the graph on the left, where we see this, again, this hard Eurosceptic vote share, we don't necessarily see a pattern. We see some countries where the share of feeling exclusively national, note, it's very high in Britain. It's the highest in any of these countries, okay, that fits. But if we look at the kind of medium level of countries where people, where, you know, a third of the country feel exclusively national, we see varying support for these hard Eurosceptic parties. So it doesn't sit so nicely. Actually, here on the other graph, we see a development in the Netherlands where, well, if it was these Eurosceptic, these extreme right parties that were mobilizing these exclusively national considerations against the EU, we see an increase in their vote share, but we see a decrease of people feeling exclusively national. So I'm not saying it's not important, but it might not necessarily account for this rise that we've seen. So what I try in the book is to say, not that these people are wrong, right? There is something about interest, there is something about identity, but there's something else going on. And that something else is what I'm trying to focus on. So I developed what I term a benchmark theory of support and skepticism, and it comes from kind of work in behavioral economics that makes arguments that people, when they make decisions, they benchmark them against something, and that's usually very important how that benchmark is perceived. And the very simple intuition is that a lot of the literature thus far studies public opinion about the EU in isolation of public opinion towards their national system. And I think that that's not a good idea. That the way people perceive their own country and the way they perceive the national political or economic considerations has a bearing on how they perceive the EU. And I'm going to try to convince you of that. So the simple intuition is that the way people evaluate the EU is crucially dependent on the national context in which people find themselves. And as the Eurozone crisis made these national contexts extremely different, so Spain started looking extremely different from the UK, from the Netherlands, the patterns in support for European integration also started to diverge much more. And the reasons of why people were supportive or not started to diverge. So in some ways, what I try to make as an analogy is that, well, public opinion towards the EU is somewhat of a kaleidoscope reflecting people's experiences and evaluations of starkly different political and economic contexts that together make up the EU. And later on, I will argue that that will also make it very difficult for the EU to come up with a one-size-fits-all approach to Euroscepticism. Okay, so let me try to explain what I mean, and by that I'm going to define what I think Euroscepticism is. So most of the literature doesn't really define Euroscepticism, it just has a measure of support for the EU, and just the flip side of that measure is Euroscepticism, and I'm trying to more kind of theoretically define it. So how do people make these how do people come up with an opinion about the EU? So let's imagine that we could put the benefits of a system on a one-dimensional, in a one-dimensional space, and I'm going to kind of loosen that assumption in a minute, from negative to positive. And I have used here 2 points, the status quo, so that means just the people's evaluations of the benefits of current membership, of current EU membership, so that's the status quo, right, because these countries are members. And next to that is the alternative state, so that how people think about the EU is by comparing the current benefits they perceive are associated with membership and their ideas about what an alternative state will look like. And that's exactly what also the referendum campaign in the UK was about, right? The alternative state will lead to a meltdown of the economy and house prices, or it will give us so much extra money to put in the NHS, it's going to be amazing, right? So, and that alternative state is also fundamentally unknown and therefore very easily manipulated, right? And that's what I'm going to talk about in a minute as well. So the difference here is that comparison, and that's what I call the EU differential. You could also call it just the added value of the EU or not. So in this case, it's a loss, right? So people's perception of the benefit of the alternative state are closer to the positive than to the negative, where the status quo is close to the negative than the positive, right? So that difference is negative. People will perceive membership as a loss, and they're skeptic. So the opposite holds true for EU support. So people, we use usually the word Euroscepticism, and on the other side we don't use Euro support, we seem to be using EU support. So I'm just going to use that language as well. So in this case, you can imagine a situation in which people perceive that the status quo is more positive, the benefits of the status quo are more positive than those of the alternative state. So here we see that the EU differentials, the added value of the EU is a gain. So in this case, people are supporters. So the question is here, I look at which benefits will people consider. So I just thought about it as kind of as a single dimension, but of course people think about many benefits, right? So based on a distinction by Robert Dahl between substantive and procedural elements of representative democracy, and that can be of any type of representative democracy, and the EU also sees itself, and the nation states in Europe see themselves as representative democracies. So substantively, people care about the quality of current policy outcomes. So when they evaluate political systems, they care about what that system produces. So that I refer to as policy preferences. And procedurally, they care about how the system works. If that system works fairly, they can be more certain that in the future, they will also get good outcomes. So those are regime preferences. So people care about outcomes now, and they care about outcomes in the future, and in order for outcomes in the future to be good, the system must articulate preferences in a fair way. So that's important because what we can now do is we can create a typology where we put the EU policy differential, so those are the outcomes and how people perceive the status quo versus the alternative state. And on the other end is the EU differential, regime differential, which has to do with people's evaluations of the system. And now what you can see is that you get four types of support or skepticism. You have exit skeptics, so those that perceive that the alternative state outperforms the status quo, both in policy and regime. You have loyal supporters who are the opposite of that. They think that the EU, the added value of the EU, both in regime and policy, is greater. Policy skeptics who think that there is maybe some a benefit on the basis of the regime on the EU, but not so much in the policies, or those that are regime skeptics. So exit skeptics were the British, right? In the kind of exit referendum, and I'll show that in a minute. Loyal supporters, one could, for example, think then still of the Greeks, right, or the Spanish. Regime skeptics are many of those that might care about the democratic deficit of the European Union, right? So they think that the policies might be okay, but what the regime produces is worse than what they have at home. Policy skeptics, I find only the Czechs in that category. The quality of government overall in the Czech Republic, not Czechoslovakia, David Davies. In the Czech Republic is probably lower than that of the EU, but people higher in the EU than in the Czech Republic. But the policies coming out of the EU are perceived as more skeptical. So if we take kind of the shares just in public opinion, and in the book you can find how I measure this, etc. I'm just not going to go into that. That nowadays what we find is about roughly 45% of people fall in the loyal support category. So this is EU 28. So this is all member states. But the majority is skeptic. However, not uniformly skeptic. And of the skeptic category, regime skepticism is the highest. So that will probably in some ways be the Habermas's of this world, right? We think that there's an additional element of like having policy and having some form of a community of scale. However, the regime at the European level might be deficient in some ways. So why is it important to differentiate between these four categories? Well, one could such say, well, if we just have skepticism versus support, can that not be enough? So what I will show you, and what I show in various chapters in the book, is that there is an important difference between those people, and we know that from the psychology literature, of those people who hold unified preferences versus those people who hold ambivalent preferences. So ambivalence means that you like and dislike something at the same time. So those are policy and regime skeptics, right? So they like some of the policies coming out of the EU, but not necessarily the regime or the other way around. Exit skeptics and loyal supporters have unified attitudes. And what we know from a lot of literature, and I'll show that in a minute, is that people who hold unified attitudes are much more likely to follow through in terms of the behavior. So they'll use these preferences when they vote, for example. And what I'll show is that exit skeptics are much more likely to vote for hard Eurosceptic parties, are much more likely to say that they will vote out in an EU referenda. Where policy and regime skeptics, it's not so easy to predict their behavior, right? But why is it important nonetheless to differentiate between them? Because as I show in the book, there is a road from loyal support to regime skeptics to exit skeptics, and from loyal skeptics to policy skeptics, from loyal support to policy skeptics to exit skeptics. So it can be a pathway, if you will, through more kind of exit skeptic attitudes. There's not many people who go from loyal support all the way to exit skeptics. First something changes and then the other thing changes. So nonetheless, it is important to differentiate between them, but that means that if we look only at behavioral outcomes or how people vote in a European parliamentary election, we might be underestimating the degree to which people are actually flirting with some skeptical attitudes. So just to give you a sense of where the countries, that's always interesting. These, of course, are like averages in an entire population. So this is data from 2008 to 2014. So the survey was done pre the kind of release, the Greek meltdown, so the start of the Eurozone crisis, and 2014, the latest time point that we have in European election survey at the time of writing. And what you see, and what is important to take away, is that Britain was already in 2014 in that kind of exit skeptic category. If I would make any prediction of a country, if there would be a referendum, who would vote out? It would be Sweden on the basis of this. Who knows if that prediction holds through or not, right? But what is interesting, what you see in 2008 versus 2014, you see the different colors of dots. So those different colors of dots are those countries that perform well economically and perform well in terms of quality of government. Those are the darker dots. So they do above the EU average in terms of economic performance and quality of government. The more gray points are those that perform below the EU average. And what you seem to have been happening in the Eurozone crisis is that countries that do well economically and in terms of quality in government are much more likely now to flock together in the Eurosceptic category, regime or exit, and the countries that do relatively poorly in the kind of EU average in terms of quality of government, so have corruption problems, for example, or have been hard hit by the Eurozone crisis, actually are now in the loyal support category. That's not at all in line with this interest explanation, but it can be explained by this alternative state, right? So if you benchmark the alternative state by current conditions, economic growth or economic conditions are going well, quality of government is high, you see that the alternative state is a viable exit option to membership. Whereas countries like Portugal, Spain, also Greece, their fallback option is to go into a country where growth is slow, where unemployment is high, and quality of government is low. So their alternative state is not as highly valued. There is effectively no exit option. This is also important for the EU to recognize, because this is not necessarily love for the EU, right? There is no exit option, right? So the question will be, if those countries do better, and that's the EU always says, well, if the countries do better in terms of growth, we will see more support. Well, it could be the opposite, right? That actually more growth leads to more skepticism. So now to illustrate the importance of this viability of the alternative, so here I just get these shares again of loyal supporters, policy skepticism, exit skeptics, and regime skeptics, now by bad economic conditions, good economic conditions, so in terms of growth, below and above the EU average, and low and high quality of government, Eurostat and Gothenburg quality of government indicators. And what you see now is that loyal support is much higher in low quality and bad economic conditions, low quality of government conditions and bad economic conditions, Exit skepticism is much higher in high quality of government conditions and good economic conditions, right? So this kind of fits this idea that the alternative state, and people benchmark the alternative state by current conditions, high quality of government and economic conditions. And I also do a couple of more survey experiments in the book to illustrate that. So one element is, okay, these countries are doing well, they're part of the EU, so why are they not attributing this to the EU? So in many of the experiments that I run in the book, I show, well, because people engage in what something a political psychologist, Stanley Feldman, has called proximate responsibility of attribution of policy, and that is people attribute economic performance and quality of government to actions of their national government, not to the EU. So Germany is doing well, not because of the EU, but because of Angela Merkel, right? Spain is not doing well, not because of, that's also because of Rajoy. So that leads in high-performing environments, people to have a higher likelihood to turn away from the EU, and in low-performing environments, to stick to the EU, right? So this pattern is symmetrical, in the sense that low quality of government and economic conditions lead to more loyal support, high economic performance and quality of government conditions lead to more exit skepticism. One important thing to realize here is that A, growth might not be the silver bullet for the EU. Secondly, also, that people can be Eurosceptic not because of anything the EU does, but because of national conditions and their evaluations of national conditions. And that's very important to keep in mind. Right? So that's not something how we've thought about. So EU support might not necessarily be only about the EU. That's basically what I'm saying. Or skepticism. So to give you a little, before I go kind of to the last question of where and who, so what I said is to give you a little bit of sense of where we see these types. Well, loyal supporters, highest share in Poland, Slovenia, and Spain, where we saw that. They're mostly female with average education who are financially anxious. Then policy skeptics in the Czech Republic, Ireland, Hungary, they're male with slightly lower education, but not very financially anxious. And this is measured on several ways. For example, can you pay your bills? These kind of questions. Regime skepticism, highest in Germany, Finland, and France. Older males who are higher educated, not very financially anxious. And high share of exit skeptics are now in the Netherlands, Sweden, and the UK, as we just saw. Older males who are slightly lower educated but not very financially anxious. And the interesting element is it really doesn't necessarily fit so nicely with this interest explanation. We find that those people who do relatively well, who are not that financially anxious, are more likely to be Eurosceptic than those who are financially anxious. So what's also important is that these different types are not only important to think about because they are in different areas, but because they have different behavioral consequences and these people want different things. So loyal supporters, unemployment is the policy priority. 83% of them would vote Remain if there would be an EU membership referendum in their country. Only 23 support a soft left Eurosceptic party, but as I show in some more in-depth analysis, that's basically because of the left stance of that party, not because of the Eurosceptic stance of the party. Policy skeptics, immigration and unemployment are policy priorities. They also display a high likelihood to vote for Remain. They support either a hard or soft right Eurosceptic party. Exit skeptics, immigration, top priority. Only 63% vote Remain. 42% support a hard right Eurosceptic party. Regime skeptics, unemployment is the key priority. 82% would vote Remain. And 31% in the European election survey support a soft left or hard right Eurosceptic party. So what's important to see is that we see clearly that loyal supporters are much more likely to want to Remain, less likely to vote for a Eurosceptic party, and the reverse is true for exit skeptics. The majority of EU nationals want to remain in the EU, but this is getting closer to the 50 mark, right, for exit skeptics, and both in terms of their support for hard Eurosceptic parties and their vote to Remain. For policy skeptics, we see a more mixed bag, and that kind of fits the idea that ambivalent citizens are less likely to use those kind of considerations to vote for, because we don't see as clear of a link between their behavior in terms of voting in a referendum or voting in a European parliamentary election. So a little bit about Brexit. So I talked about the alternative state. So what's important about Brexit, we did a panel survey that we find in 2016 among the EU 27, so Britain is not in here, we find that for all the different categories, so loyal, policy, regime, and exit skeptics, support has gone up. And this fits the idea that I highlighted, that the way people think about the EU is the status quo versus the alternative state. Their status quo didn't really change, but they got a signal about the alternative state. Millions wiped out of the stock exchange, the pound went down, et cetera, et cetera. This was the entire turmoil period, right? We don't know if this lasts, but more recent surveys has also shown that support for the EU is kind of going up in the EU 27. And my argument in the book is that this is partly because people have now been able to get a sense of what the alternative state would look like, uncertain. So even if in the kind of northern European countries where economic conditions are good and quality of government is high, i.e. skepticism is more of a phenomenon, Brexit might be a break on that. The question is for how long, right? And also how political entrepreneurs will play it and how long the Brexit negotiation will go on. This is important for the UK in Brexit negotiations because this would suggest that it's in the strategic interest of EU and national leaders to set a bad precedent for leaving, right? Because the alternative state should not look good. Because if the alternative state looks good, Euroscepticism is going to rise, and there might be exit referenda in other countries, although those are going to be more difficult to get through Parliament. And definitely, even if there's a deal, the benefits of the ideal need to be smaller than membership, right? Because otherwise, this might spark off exit demands in other richer Northern European countries. So this is not necessarily a good news for UK negotiators. So the last part is, why should we care about this, right? So what I've argued is that there's different types of skepticism, and this is important because they give rise to very different policy priorities. And also in the book I show that they also give different reform preferences, so they want to see the EU reformed in a different way. I didn't talk about that. But this makes it clear that a one-size-fits-all policy response is unlikely to going to be successful. Exit skeptics care about immigration, where loyal supporters care about unemployment. If you reduce intra-EU migration from the south or from the east to the north, this might take care of some of the concerns of exit skeptics, but will open up a whole can of worms for loyal supporters who want to see stronger growth in their particular countries, right? So it's going to be very difficult to deal with all these conflicting demands. These different types have very different behavioral consequences, and some types are more important for the survival of the European Union than others, i.e. exit skeptics. So the share of exit skeptics is going to be crucially important because they are much more likely to vote out, or to say that they would vote out for in an exit referendum, and they're much more likely to vote for hard Eurosceptic parties that want to demand, or that they want to leave and that demand an exit referenda. And this is important, just kind of the illustration to the Brussels crowd, if you will. And this is a quote by Juncker when he was still Luxembourg Prime Minister. So this is important because if these EU considerations inform people's vote choices in European parliamentary elections, in referendums, and in national elections, they're going to be crucially important for re-election of governments. So what he once said is, we know what to do, we just don't know how to get re-elected once we do it, given that a one-size policy, that it might be more difficult now in this case to find what ought to be done. It also is going to be very difficult to get re-elected after you have done it, right? So this is going to be an important kind of decade of uncertainty, I think, for the EU. So I think the EU is in an existential challenge. How to deal with these extreme heterogeneity and demands at a time when proposals for increasing cooperation and electoral democracy at the EU level that could deal with some of these preference heterogeneity are very difficult to achieve because they would require treaty change, which would trigger referenda, and thus risk domestic ratification failures. And actually in the book also I show that majority of people don't want this. They don't want any elected EU president or more supranational power sharing with the Commission or the European Parliament vis-à-vis the national governments. So how can you then deal with preference heterogeneity? Political scientists often think we deal with preference heterogeneity by giving everybody a vote, right? That's the way to do it. But in this case, it will be very difficult to do. So I see three ways forward, and this is more speculative, right? So more muddling through, and that's what basically the EU has done in the entire crisis, right? No treaty change, but it might stumble from crisis to crisis, right? Because there's no actual policy reform. An ever closer union. So if you, for example, follow Newsnight sometime, Guy Verhofstadt in his pamphlet to create a United States of Europe, this is his idea. We have to do the great leap forward, more federalization or federal Europe. So the problem with this is that there's little support for this among the public to do this. And then also elections and referendum that will be put up have proven already in the UK, but in other contexts will be very divisive. And the heterogeneity within the EU is going to make it very likely that pan-EU-wide elections for a European president are going to be about us versus them, the Spanish versus the Germans, or actually the added value of the EU. And some of the work that we've done on looking at approval ratings for Angela Merkel, 10% of Spanish people approve of Angela Merkel, 9% of Italians, 3% of Greeks, 87% of Dutch, 82% of Germans, and almost 90% of Luxembourgians, right? So who's going to get that EU presidency is going to be crucial. And the nationality cannot be flanked out here because of the reasons that I outlined, is that people look at the EU through their national lenses. So the last thing that I would suggest, what could be tried, right, is to allow for more flexibility. If you have preference heterogeneity, one way to deal with it is to get more flexible integration. So instead of a single-wide, continental-wide jurisdiction, allow for multiply functionally specific policy regime with overlapping national memberships. And actually in some ways we have that already. The Eurozone, Schengen, etc. I mean, you can institutionalize them and do them in more. And people might, Greece could have gone into the euro and out of the euro. I mean, there are, Stiglitz wrote a very interesting book about that there are ways to organize this. So these kind of policy regimes could be then also competing, and individuals could decide which of these units they wanted to belong to. Probably there needs to be a supranational core, something that needs to be agreed upon, right? But others could be more functionally specific in case of need and could be overlapping national memberships rather than one big single wide jurisdiction. So the essence of Europe is diversity, and successful integration should perhaps be defined not as harmonization or homogenization, but rather based on the idea of flexibility. And in some ways this will be much more realistic, because the idea or the language that comes out of Brussels a lot is about one size fits all, but in kind of real conditions, about 40% of laws are diversified nationally, as Vincent and Schimmelpfennig have shown repeatedly. So there is kind of overall laws coming out of the EU that you have to comply with the goal, but the way you do it can be very much diversified. So possible criticism towards a flexible integration could be, well, this increases complexity and leads to less efficiency. Well, the problem is one size fits all. When the one size fits all solution cannot work, will by definition be inefficient. And that's what also a lot of the critique of the handling of the Greek crisis has been, right? So don't ignore the present and what we're in right now. Then some people could suggest, well, it actually decreases democratic accountability because you allow for so much variability that, European parliamentary elections, will they be for whom or for what part of the EU? So in one way, what some propose, and the EU has already started to do this, is what it could happen is that we actually shift the locus of responsibility for what happens in these different jurisdictions at the national level rather than at the European level. Because what it will be is about nations to decide in which of these jurisdictions they will be a part.
Some people suggest, well, this might lead to more executive drift, that governments become more important as they are already. Well, the European Union has already started to do it, but could do that more by making national parliaments stronger within EU policy making. That will be a way to deal with it, to kind of combine number 2 and 3. So the last thing could be, well, this leads to too much fragmentation and irrelevance on the world stage. Well, the EU now is fragmented. Just because we're unified as kind of 27 member states against Brexit, the question is that really true, and how much differentiation is really under the surface? There were lots of problems with the Eurozone, with refugee crisis, which are leading to fragmentation, and we've seen that of also some of the sounds coming out of the Czech Republic or Poland or Hungary, as well as what's coming out of Italy and Spain at the moment. So in that way, we would need to be realistic in the sense if we're currently on a path that will be more unified. No, maybe we're actually on the path towards more fragmentation, and what we need to do is to institutionalize that fragmentation in a better way. So at the end of the book, I try to kind of make a plea for more flexible integration, and to see the EU, and in that way I think even David Cameron's push on getting an ever closer union out on the preamble is not only semantic. It's the idea of, well, maybe success can be defined as multiple roads to a policy solution, not necessarily as a one road. And imagine a union that's comprised of countries or regions, kind of linked to the current Catalan discussion, that wish to be bound together by a currency, that wish to be bound together by a common border, or that we wish to be held together by common markets and outside partners, because people are convinced that it strengthens their country rather than weakens it. And in some ways, it was not without a reason that in some countries, people started questioning what the added value of the EU was, because in some cases, there is a question about what the exact added value is. So, the bottom line of the talk, I guess, is that there's no such thing as a Eurosceptic. There are many types of Eurosceptics. These types of Eurosceptics are important because they lead to certain behavioral consequences and certain policy preferences. And these people want to see the EU reformed in different ways. And in order to deal with that preference heterogeneity that's now ingrained and encapsulated in the EU and exacerbated through the Eurozone crisis, it will be important for the EU to find an answer that deals with that flexibility. And for the reasons I've outlined, I think both muddling through and trying to scale it all up to an ever closer union are just going to be extremely unrealistic. So maybe a middle-of-the-road approach by allowing some countries to move together and some to move apart, and to institutionalize some of those practices might be the way to go. So thanks very much for your attention. The book is out in February, and do stay in touch. There's several ways. I'm also quite active on Twitter, for example, so do stay in touch.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the analytical clarity, for for making sense of something that is hard sometimes to make sense of. I want to just start off by asking you a little bit of Brexit at the end, because one of the things that this doesn't necessarily pick up on is how it is that countries can change position quite quickly. What I wanted to say was that Euroscepticism was not a major issue in British politics for most of our membership of the European Union. In elections, as you know, in public opinion surveys, the issue of the European Union was quite low down people's public preferences. But then suddenly there was a shift, quite a dramatic shift, which is time-bound, probably around 3 or 4 years, that Britain went from being a broadly skeptical but embedded member to a highly skeptical member. And I wonder what you think of the conditions of that shift, and therefore how vulnerable are your categories here? Because it does seem that, in short times things can happen. And so what explains, do you think, the fact that Britain was always a skeptical member, but suddenly was willing to become thoroughly skeptical across all regime and policy?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so earlier on the graph, in 2008, Britain was in the regime skeptical category, right? So apparently there were some policy benefits perceived, but the system was seen as deficient, and that was also what you get a lot of. Westminster is, the way we do politics here is better than a bureaucracy in Brussels. But one of the elements that I make in the book is that the Eurozone crisis where fates of one member state versus the other, and then what the average of the EU is, started to diverge so much that the question of like, what have you done for me lately, and what can you prove to be for me in the future, became very pertinent. I do think that Euroscepticism in Britain was a much stronger force in politics, in public opinion, than was kind of thought out for a long time. Actually, you see it in policy. I mean, Britain has been one of the most, in every public opinion survey, has been one of the most Eurosceptic of EU countries, right? You saw that of like 60% of people feeling exclusively British, so having, and then the next so no, I mean, there's almost no one feels European, and then if the other combination is it's European and national, right? So many of these indicators suggest that British public opinion was much more Eurosceptic and closer to, for example, Sweden, which has also been a country that is on that kind of Eurosceptic stance. So in that way, there was something there which probably laid more or less dormant and was not necessarily seen as the most important issue at that moment in time. And that fits the idea that Britain for a long time was these ambivalent skeptics, regime skeptics. So it's very different. They won't act upon this as clearly, but when they move into the exit category, and what's happened in the Eurozone crisis is that what British people saw was deteriorating were the policies coming out of the EU, right? So they were regime skeptics, and they saw that and that in some ways makes sense for British, because what happened was that the EU started focusing primarily on the saving of the Eurozone, which is not in the interest of Britain. In some ways, right? I mean, at least that's not how it's perceived by the majority of the public. I'm not saying that I agree with that, but so in that way, that shift, and then the idea of having a referendum or putting it into your manifesto, the first choice of David Cameron, then an unexpected victory of getting an absolute majority that I don't think he expected, nor any pollster expected, and then he actually had to put up the referendum, etc., etc., etc. And we do know that referenda in the EU are extremely hard to predict. The majority of EU referenda go negative, right? The Maastricht referenda, the referenda on the constitutional treaty, the referenda in Ireland. So I think the shift has been Eurosceptic, but gradually from regime skeptics to what I show in the book, from regime skeptics to more exit skepticism, and that had to do with that the EU became focused on policies that majority of British people didn't think was in their interest. If that's wrong or right, that's not what I'm saying, but that's how it was perceived. And then with the referendum campaign, that was exploited.
Very clear. Thank you. But you didn't mention migration, but of course then the European response to migration would have compounded what you just said, would have shifted Britain from regime skepticism into complete policy skepticism. So it wasn't just the Euro crisis. Once the time the migration crisis, that was like a double blow.
Exactly.
And
it's quite different. It's at the same time. It's difficult to differentiate which of the two is.
Sure.
Right?
Okay. Many thanks. So over to you guys. We've got a mic roaming around. A question over there.
Would you say flexible integration, wouldn't that lead to an increase in regime skepticism? And then that could possibly, because I think if it's to do with self-interest against sort of the ideals of the European dream, by flexible integration, it would make the situation also do with self-interest. And then that could fragment the European Union even more, and then could lead to more Euroscepticism. What would you think?
Yeah. So I guess the way I perceive people's evaluations of the regime is that they more or less think that the future policies that they will get will, that they have an idea that the regime functions in such a way that policy outcomes in the future could also be in their interest, right? So the question is like, would a federal union or something like that make people have a higher evaluation of the regime vis-a-vis some form of flexible integration, right? So my worry is that within the north of Europe, primarily, it's the countries that we saw, quality of government is so high that probably a federal state like the EU can never fully reach that, right? So that we probably have to live with some degree of regime skepticism in these countries. Then the question is, well, can we then persuade them, basically, through policies and outcomes, right? So that we make sure that those are more directed and targeted to what countries would really need at that moment in time. People like David Easton have also argued that the better the policies are that are being provided, people start trusting the regime more as well. So it doesn't necessarily mean that regime skepticism leads to policy the other way around. You could actually see a situation in which, well, a country can go from exit skepticism into regime skepticism at a certain point, perhaps in loyal support again. So, I mean, ultimately, that is an empirical question, but I don't see how federalizing it up and coming up with with policy solutions that would fit EU 27 member states that are so differentiated in what they need policy-wise would not lead to regime skepticism. The question of flexible integration that you say, perhaps. So right? So in that way, I would say that the chances of trying to do something else, and then maybe the chances that people will respond to that in a better way than they've done in the past will make it worth to try. And that's what I'm saying. And also, in some ways, it's probably more realistic because a lot of integration is already diversified. It's just that someone like Juncker never mentions that, right? He's always focusing on what are the ideas for reform, what are the next things that will be done. That also, for example, was greeted, his State of the Union speech was greeted with a lot of skepticism by the Dutch Prime Minister, who, for example, his response was, well, people with visions should maybe see the optometrist, right? I mean, that was his response to Juncker. And it was like, well, what we need is something that works and not something that has a particular type of idea. So I don't know that, but I would say that the other option is less likely to produce less regime skepticism in the future.
There is a really interesting parallel in what you're saying at the international global level. In the breakup of the old top-down multilateral treaty as the one-size-fits-all model for solving problems to a much more flexible integration model, which is you see now, let's say, in the Paris Agreement. So from the movement from the failure of the multilateral paradigm in Copenhagen to Paris, you get a much more flexible integration model. And at the global level too, I think that shift in paradigm is really important. And therefore, it probably sets out a pathway for possible alternative changes in other fields too. And interesting, the book I just talked to you about earlier, the one just published called Beyond Gridlock, finds that consistently across policy areas at the international level, that movements towards flexible integration are more likely now to yield benefits than persisting with a top-down, single, homogeneous treaty. It's a very interesting parallel. Yes. Yeah. Gentleman at the front, you might say who your name is, Mark. Mark Shaw.
Catherine, there are various theories, as you know, of European integration, and you sort of hinted at functionalism and neo-functionalism. Where would you put this? Is this the start of a new theory, or would you fit this into one of the existing frameworks?
Part of the conclusion I left out. So how does this link to kind of the grand theories of European integration? So we usually think of the grand theories of European integration as either intergovernmental or liberal intergovernmental, where basically member states drive European integration and EU institutions are somewhat on the leash of member states. The opposite, I mean, this is a very long history of thought, but and the opposite is neo-functionalism or functionalism, where the idea is, well, actually the drivers are European bureaucracies and European officials that then push member states to do something that they necessarily don't want. So in some ways, what both of those theories share is a very elite-driven perspective. So they focus almost primarily on what elites do and what government officials do or European officials do. This, in some ways, really brings in party politics, domestic politics, in a way perhaps that was ingrained in some of Andrew Moravcik's interpretation of liberal intergovernmentalism, that what mattered, but what he focused on were producer groups, right? He focused very much on economic interest, because it was only about the market, I mean, or primarily about the market at that moment in time. So in some ways, maybe it's the closest to a more liberal intergovernmental approach, in the sense that it really focuses on how national developments drive what's happening and constrain what elites can do at the European level. But I do think that a lot of the existing grand theories, which basically haven't really been updated since the since kind of the collapse of public opinion, don't really take into account, you know, political parties, Eurosceptic entrepreneurs that are not taking the same positions as governments, and public opinion. And also they don't really take into account the importance of national elections and European referendums as possible disruptive forces or ratification failures. So in some ways, I hope that kind of answers your question somewhat. Yeah.
Hello, yeah, thank you for your talk. There was a couple of things that I found really interesting. One was where you said, you know, it's not in the centre's interest to have any state have a good alternative state if they leave. For obvious reasons, that'd be more attractive to other people who are thinking of leaving. So in your flexible approach, you know, if you look at the hard facts at the moment, you know, the EU is based on 4 freedoms: freedom of movement of goods, services, capital, and people. And what we seem to be, you know, in the midst of is wanting to only have 3 of those. And I think on Twitter they call that Brexit la-la land. So I'd love to know, you know, do you think that's, you can cherry pick and pick 3 or 4 freedoms, and the ones who can't be flexible still agree? That was my first point. And the second was, you mentioned Wisconsin, and certainly my take on what happened in Wisconsin, part of it was not so much that they voted for an alternative state, but actually for less state. They wanted just less government, period, wherever it was coming from. And I wondered if your research had covered any of that, you know, anti-establishment pitch rather than anti-EU or Westminster.
Yeah. Great, both great questions. So with regard to the Brexit la-la land, or the freedoms, I think this is also what makes the Brexit negotiations so enormously difficult for this country. Because this is going to happen. It's going to happen in the EU. I can't see, I mean, I shouldn't predict, but I cannot see a situation in which free movement of people is going to survive after Brexit. Because the other countries are sharpening their knives, and they're actually already acting against it, right? I mean, the Dutch are just not doing it in some areas. They've not been taken to court yet, but they're interpreting their room very freely, right? So Britain will be the test case, and Britain cannot get it because of the reasons I outlined, right? So that will be preferable for many Northern European member states to have that type of deal. So it will be hard, so depending on how long the Brexit negotiations will be, but that would be first, okay, that cannot happen, and then I'm pretty sure we're going to see a softening of free movement of people. I can't see it in any other way. The worry I have about that, if you then think about Italy or you think about Spain, my husband is Spanish, for example, youth unemployment of close to 50%. I mean, that is a serious problem, and partly of why free movement of people is so important is because my husband had to go somewhere, right? So, because there were just not enough jobs. So in that way, that might actually lower the status quo for some other members. So that's going to be very tricky, right? I guess on the basis of this, you can say, well, you can get away with that, right? Because their alternative state is so much worse. But I think in the Brexit negotiation, I cannot see it conceivable that the EU will grant the UK any of that, because that will be, you know, that will be counter everything, that will spark off of discussions. But after that, I'm pretty sure it's going to get on the table. Or if the kind of southern member states grow so much that you know that there's a change, and that will. But I think also what we have to remember is that so I work quite closely with some organizations, for example, in Romania. A doctor in Romania makes 300 euros, right? So there's a lot of interest to move, and that is totally understandable, and that is in their self-interest. And they can, but of course that also raises questions for people in other countries. And the issue, of course, is that many, and that we can go into the intellectual discussion about immigration, that majority of studies done by economists or by the OECD show that many of these countries need immigration, but that's not how it's perceived by voters in elections. So, that's going to be a very difficult thing to do. Then with regard to the question about Wisconsin and about the rejection of the state. So this is quite interesting that some of the countries, some of the parties, and I'm going to take I'm Dutch by origin, I'm going to take the Netherlands as an example, where you have a radical right and a radical left party which are Eurosceptic, but they're both extremely pro-state. So Geert Wilders is one of the defenders of the social welfare state in the Netherlands, as is Emiel Roemer, so the leader of the left party. So I think it's a quite different discussion in Europe, partly because we have a much bigger welfare state and people have rights and they want to protect those rights. And in some of the areas, in some of the more in-depth studies of the reasons why people vote, I look at what are the primarily, can I predict voting for a hard Eurosceptic party or voting leave by looking at exit skeptics and the considerations they have. So what seems to be really driving this for exit skeptics is national control, anti-immigration, and anti-globalization sentiment. Whatever that latter element is very difficult to know, but less so by anti-elitism. So less that we find a little bit less. Some, but not but not by state intervention in the economy or things like that, which would be more this deep state or kind of state opposition. So in the UK, we find much more anti-elite sentiment that seems to be driving it in the Brexit referendum that we found that I found. There's some, but what seems to be really important is this sense of wanting to have more national control. That seems to be quite uniform, and people either who care about unemployment considerations or people who care about immigration considerations.
Interesting, very.
Evening, Catherine. Thanks so much for your speech. Your model obviously is quite good at explaining Euroscepticism and Britain leaving the Union. I wondered if you'd considered flipping it the other way and thinking about when Britain joined the Union, or what was then the common market. Does it explain why in 1975 the sort of Leave campaign of Tony Benn and co really didn't have any traction with the public at all? Or is there sort of an alternative explanation?
So in the other part that in the chapter on kind of Brexit, I come up, it's just kind of a historical example, but the context of the 75 referendum could have not been more different to the 2016. In the 2016, we were talking about it over dinner before, it was a kind of like the cool Britannia, Britain was doing extremely well economically, it was growing faster than much of the Eurozone. In 1975, Britain was the sick man of Europe. Right? There were strikes, there were electricity shutdowns, there were huge internal problems. And economically, the UK stood in a very different order to continental Europe than it stood in 2016. And I think that's part of the explanation, that it's very difficult to make people go into the risk of leaving when the conditions in the country are not perceived as good. Because everybody must understand that there will be some risk involved with leaving, because people are usually on average status quo orientated. They're only going to do that when they think that the potential gains of leaving are going to be higher. And how do they benchmark that? By how well their country is doing at that moment in time. So the 75 campaign of not entering and so on didn't have the kind of fertile ground of an economy doing well and Britain being perceived as kind of the leader in Europe. No, it was rather the opposite. It was, well, we actually might need this common market in order to develop and get out of this sluggish growth and do better vis-a-vis some countries on the continent. So I think that's crucially important, the kind of the conditions at that moment in time of how the alternative state could be framed. And it was very different in 75 than in 2016.
Thanks very much for a really interesting talk. I had a question, sort of a factual question first, and then a question why, if that's right. So I know in Britain, a lot of the story that we get is about economic motivations for Brexit and left behind work and so on. But when you look at what are the best predictors of Brexit sentiment, education is much more important than class or income or any of those indicators. So usually people say education, and they want you to think about income, but education seems to be doing something different. And I noticed that you.
I find it.
So first, the factual question: is education much more important as a predictor of Euroscepticism, not just in Britain but across Europe? And if so, why?
A very good question. So, and that's also very difficult to sometimes disentangle. So we know education is, I don't know about if it's the most important driver, but it is a driver. And exit skeptics are on average slightly lower education. So if you think about the primary exit skeptic, it's the kind of small shop owners and the small bourgeois that Marine Le Pen talks about. And those are on average not the most highly educated. I mean, they're educated, but they're not most highly educated. Where regime skeptics are much more, so that's why I kind of use the Habermas, right? So people who can have kind of their queries with Europe, but nonetheless kind of ultimately accept the idea of it. So yes, there is some relationship. The question is why. So if you think about it in my way, and I didn't talk so much about it, but in the book I go into more risk assessment and how people use risk and benchmark risk and so on, is that it could be that in some ways that when you're educated for longer, you become more risk averse. So for example, we find a male, female. So females are on average much more risk averse than males. We find a huge gender difference in exit skepticism. So if it's about this move, going the leap of faith of leaving, well, that might be, so maybe education does that to some extent. The other element is that people might be actually educated about the alternative state, but then what is really interesting, that there's some work that's more anthropological and also something in qualitative sociology that suggests that what also partly schools do is they educate you about the status quo and acceptance of the status quo. So if that's the case, that you should find them probably more status quo biased, i.e. EU membership, we should care, and that's good, and they have actually developed arguments at school with that. In the UK case, I'm not so entirely sure. I wonder, when I first taught the kind of policy of the EU at Oxford, there were not many Brits in my lectures, and the overall knowledge about the EU was a little bit, so I don't know how ingrained it is here in schooling systems. But in the Netherlands, you do get this kind of the story about PEEF and how it developed, etc., etc. So you could also think about a situation in which people just at school are taught more arguments to stick to the status quo and are better able to articulate them and then at a certain point also maybe believe them. But this is all pure speculation. I haven't seen studies that try to kind of do the causal effect on education.
Do you want to come back on that?
Yeah, I mean, there's the points you make are really important. I think you're right. There's a lot that needs to be unpicked there. It just how the effect of education on the Brexit vote was just so marked compared to the kind of conventional drivers, conventional explanations of that I just find it difficult to imagine that those kind of explanations, the kind of schooling explanations, can explain it. And I mean, the connection as well with kind of social authoritarian values as opposed to redistributive values as well. That education seems really important, independent of those value dimensions as well, which, my first guess would have been that's what's driving these, driving education as a factor, but education seems just so important as an explanatory factor.
So I think in the models in Europe we find it a little bit, it's not the same kind of, and I don't particularly I don't try to predict Brexit votes, so I know of some of these studies that try to do that using the British election study or other kind of constituency data, is in the sense that, 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 is in the sense that yeah, I mean, it would be really interesting to kind of trace people across their kind of like, have a panel study of younger people and see how they develop. And also, I mean, I presume that we know that there's, even if you grow up in, let's say, a Eurosceptic household, that if you then at a certain point in school are being taught that, well, the EU is good for this and blah, 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 that should have some effect on how you will perceive it, right? In some ways also, part of the education effect could also be skills that people later on think that they can use in the market, so coming back to kind of more an interest explanation. But I don't know, you know, I've not seen work trying to really unpack what schooling does. And there is some work now showing that also people who are more highly educated are less likely to hold anti-immigrant attitudes, and those are kind of causally identified. But we don't really know why. I mean, we don't really know the mechanism.
Just one final question. Do you mean schooling or higher education?
Well, so you see quite big differences at all levels. I mean, in the UK, and there is a big difference between people who've got degrees, and even bigger difference with people who've got higher degrees. But even at people who've got schooling to 14, 15, there's quite a big difference to people with schooling at 18. Yeah. I mean,
so there must be something going on. Thank you. Mr. Gentleman at the back, someone at the back? Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much for your talk. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I just had a question about, in particular, about the point you made about the loyals the loyalty to the EU. And of course, a lot of your argument is based on economic issues, but I do come from Spain as well, and I was wondering, you know, there are so many other issues that affect our loyalty to the EU, and I speak on behalf of some people, I guess not everyone, you know, and I'm thinking in particular about values coming out of a dictatorship, what, you know, culturally and politically and ideologically, what joining the EU meant was, you know, modernity, reform, peace, you know, and in fact, Spain has been very much enriched by incoming EU citizens. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe Spain is the second most popular country in the EU in terms of receiving EU migrants.
Yes, a lot of Romanians, for example.
Yeah, and 300,000 Brits, for example, which is twice as many as the Spaniards here.
As well.
Yeah, so I just wonder if you're taking into account other issues in that analysis, because I found it really interesting, but yeah. I just thought, I just wondered if you took that into account. Thank you.
Yeah, so Zapatero, the now previous prime minister in Spain of PSOE, of the Social Democrats, once said, "Oh, we've reached the Champions League of Europe," right? So and that in some ways gives you already a sense, and also the things that you said. Of course, I simplify by looking at benefits on quality of how people benchmark by looking at quality of government and looking at economic performance. But partly of this quality of government is exactly what you're saying, is how I will perceive it in my discussions also with a lot of Spaniards, but also what seems to be coming out of the data is in the sense that the quality of government at home is perceived as so much worse vis-a-vis the EU, and partly of that is, I mean, in the Eurozone crisis also, of course, one of the biggest corruption scandals ever in Spanish history, at least at large scale. Bárcenas was uncovered of the Partido Popular, of the current right-wing government. So a lot of that, as you know, I mean, lots of corruption, especially coming out of zoning and coming out of construction, makes people quite wary about how their system functions. Partly also about, you know, the kind of smooth relationship between Franco and the Partido Popular. I mean, the Partido Popular was, of course, founded by ministers of Franco. So in that way, you know, the EU creates this type of benefit for many Spaniards, both economically as using the market, right, and having that sense of being shut out of Europe for such a long time under the Franco dictatorship, and then also in terms of quality in government, right? And that's a very different story for a Dutch person, for example, and how, on average, these are averages. Doesn't mean that there are many, you're totally right. There can be many different personal stories as to why one is pro-EU, but in terms of averages or kind of average relationships. And actually, in the preface of the book, I say that one of the ideas came from this was as the Eurozone crisis started to unfolding, and I had a dinner conversation with my husband, and I said, well, in the Netherlands now, Euroscepticism on the rise because, and also because it's been kind of terrible in terms of unemployment. And he says, what is the unemployment rate? I said 7.5%. He said, don't talk ever to me about unemployment, right? So just kind of like, we have like the monopoly on that particular element. And that just make me realize of how different, and the discussions were much more about immigration or about how much we pay to Europe, whereas in Spain they were much more about what we gain from that relation. So I really started to understand that the perspective that people employ, even though there might be differences within countries, right? And as I said, on education, on being financially anxious or not, but the overall average is that Spanish history and perspective and national reference point or national benchmark, I would call it, makes it very different in Spain than it makes in the Netherlands. And I think we've in the existing work we've really kind of swept those things under the rug. And what I try to do is really to bring in that kind of complexity coming from those national reference points, while at the same time also simplifying, of course. But yeah, I think your illustration is very interesting. I think what is also interesting, I don't know how you see, like now also the discussions, of course, as the EU starts to become the defender of Rajoy in with regard to the Catalan issue. My husband is from Valencia, so not from Catalonia, but it is also changing the discussion in Catalonia about the EU, right? So, we thought you guys were all this. You were peace and security and democracy, and now you're siding with the man who is and whatever stance one has, right? I mean, Catalans say the constitution needs to be changed because it's not fair. The president, the prime minister Rajoy says, I'm just implementing the constitution, right? So whatever position one takes, but this is also interesting how now the status quo seems to have changed for some Catalans about what it actually, so in that way, it's interesting what I said is that, well, this kind of illustrates the fact that something like Brexit, where the alternative states gets benchmarked, or when something happens at the EU level, or the EU does something, can be both reasons why support goes up and down. One has to do more with national conditions, the other one has to do with EU conditions, or it could actually be the combination of those. So it kind of illustrates also the importance of how benefits of the status quo or of the alternative states are being perceived.
One last question.
Thanks. Again, really enjoyed the talk. I just wondered if there's another implication of your typology in terms of how people might behave in referendums, how different campaigns might behave in referendums, how Eurosceptic parties might behave in different sorts of situations. Because it seems to me that if it's indeed the case that there's a distinction between regime skeptics and policy skeptics, then if you're a Remain campaign in an EU referendum in any sort of hypothetical country, if you recognize that there are a lot of regime skeptics, you should try and frame debates in terms of policy as much as possible. And if you're a Eurosceptic party, you should try and frame debates as much as possible in terms of regime issues. And so is there any evidence on that in your book? Is it something you're planning to look at? It seems like an implication of the sorts of things you're saying.
Yeah, that's great. I hadn't thought about it in that particular way, but so I've done, of course, a lot of work on parties, and at a certain point when you're writing a book, you have to leave things out. So one thing I left out is how these alternative states are being framed or maybe also status quos, by political parties or by media players, and because that's a book in itself, right? So in some ways, one element of what I was thinking is moving into this. You could also apply within regions, so you could apply this in Spain, right, on the Catalan case. So that was my most, but maybe this also sounds like an interesting next project, so I'll think about it. But the one element which is really important is that I think what a lot of Leave campaigners realized is that skepticism in the UK was both these things. They really talked about the regime a lot. They talked a lot about the bureaucracy in Brussels, about getting control over our laws, and also, of course, over our borders, things that are policy implicated, but a lot of it was about kind of sovereignty in Westminster and not having this, and it was really about the regime. And the interesting element is that when you go and ask people about reforms, so you can do that by using kind of you can use experiments, that for exit skeptics, the most important thing that moves their support for reform of the EU is how they're being governed, not what is coming out. So this is really something that the Remain campaigners underestimated. They only talked about the economic effects of leaving. And they only talked about the policies. There was no sense of, well, and the interesting element with that is if you also talk about regime, with that you're also giving people a sense of being proud of Britain or something like that, right? So it is also a double whammy in some ways, but that was ultimately, I think, a strategic mistake of the Remain campaign, to frame this only in when we leave, we lose out policy-wise. And for certain people, you saw that after the referendum, we don't care. We are willing to pay the price. I mean, if there really are, I don't know, right? But some, like Eric Kaufman's or other people have done some studies suggesting that people were willing to forfeit economic growth for getting national control back. If that national control, I mean, I would be very skeptical of the extent to which that actually gives people national control, right? I'm in that way believe in a bit of kind of Millward and the EU being the rescue of the nation state, right? So of course, if you're out of the EU, you then have to go and, you know, weather all globalization by yourself. So that might be a fallacy, but it doesn't matter. It really resonated with people. People thought that it's something that they had lost, right? And that regime element was really, and the Leave campaign in Britain, in hindsight, did it correctly. They focused on both the policies, so the NHS and we can get money and we get, and the regime, and that seems crucial. So in the book, I do show that both of these elements are important, and they react in ways that we would expect. But I think we've really underestimated that people don't only care about the outcomes or the outcomes of government, but people also care about how they're governed. And that is something that Dahl already talked about, you know, in the early 1990s, but it is much more important, and we maybe should think about that a bit more. And that speaks also to kind of maybe anti-elitism sentiment or the way people perceive that element, and politicians haven't paid enough attention to that, I think.
But what would, just, you keep going, what would the Remainers have done? I mean, say, the counter-argument would have been, well, look, the EU is great, bureaucracy isn't as bad, it's good for peace. I mean, the arguments for the regime are also much harder to make.
Fair. No, fair enough. I think one thing is what you could have said is, well, when we leave the EU, right, and we have, want to keep our standard of living in the way that we want to, we will have no seat on the table. So actually we've lost out in sovereignty. Right? That's much more difficult, and it's much more intellectual. I agree with that. I mean, that's more difficult to explain. So in Spain, it's easier if you just say, "Oh, the EU is democracy, and that's better than what we have," you know, like that, or maybe in former communist regimes. But I think you could have made an argument about, well, if we leave, actually, Westminster, and that will effectively probably happen, Westminster has to adhere to laws, has to adhere to judges on which it has no control. And that's effectively worse. But I don't know if that would have come across. No, I agree with that.
I'm just trying to think of what the arguments might have been.
Yeah.
But there clearly is another book, which is a kind of revision of Machiavelli's Princes, but now advice to princes and princesses on Remain and skeptical arguments in different contexts. Because that clearly does, those are very strong implications.
Yeah, and I think one this is more a meta comment, but that's also about in the discussion about kind of populists and whatever populists exactly are. I'm never entirely sure what but if what they share is some degree of anti-establishment sentiment, of having a critique about a lot of them are pro-referenda, they have kind of an institutional development or a renewal agenda, right? And that is by many mainstream parties is just shut down. Right? That's not something, and I think these are real concerns that people have. One might disagree with them, right? I mean, but to not give any sense of, to basically only talk about the policies and don't talk about how could we make systems better in such a way that the majority of people's interests are being heard, and I think it is a real kind of important point when election results or when referendums results, at least in part, point to the fact that people feel that they're not heard. And that's not just policy-wise. That's apparently also in the way that people think that the system functions and how legitimate it is. And that is serious. I think we should pay attention to that, even beyond the kind of Euroscepticism discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.